VCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
And thank you for joining us today here on Crosstalk on the VCY America Network. Jim Schneider with you today. And folks, the information that's been pouring forth through intensive questioning by congressional committees into the IRS scandal is certainly rather shocking as to the amount of information that's coming forth, who knew what and when. There's a number of questions yet to be determined. But the information that's proceeding forth ought to be ring alarm bells for people all across the nation. We're going to be taking a look at the growing IRS scandal here today on Crosstalk and some of the issues that have come forth, as well as some of the information that needs to come forth yet. It's our privilege to have with us Robert Romano, who is senior editor with Americans for Limited Government. And just as their name implies, they are leaders in identifying, exposing, and working with Congress and state legislatures to prevent the continued expansion of government. Robert, thanks for joining us today on Crosstalk.
Hey, it's great to be on again. Thanks for having us.
I think it'd be good just to review some of the information, what's transpired to this point. When did it first become known that there's problems with the IRS singling out groups that were applying for tax-exempt status?
Well, internally, exempt organizations director Lois Lerner knew at least in June 2011, according to the Inspector General's report, although the program itself, according to the report, started way back in February of 2010. It was when they identified the Tea Party groups to target and other groups that they wanted to have special scrutiny on to see if they were engaged in political activities. What's odd about this is that 501c4 organizations are allowed by law and by rule to engage in political activities. So why they were selected out for special scrutiny when they were doing something the law allowed is one question. The other part is that 501c4 organizations are not even required to apply for tax-exempt status. They can just start operating and then just file their tax return at the end of the year. So perhaps what the determinations people in Cincinnati should have been telling these applicants was that actually an application is not necessary, and just go about your business, and we'll see your tax return. The examinations people will see your tax return at the end of the year.
Well, if this was happening back in 2010 and in 2011, Lois Lerner knew of this. Yet there have been times in which IRS testimony has been given before committees of Congress, and never once was a word uttered saying, "Hey, we've got a problem here," in that there's been the scrutiny of right-leaning groups.
Even after supposedly the problem was rectified and the targeting had ceased, but nonetheless, even after the targeting by determinations had already ceased, the groups that were already selected for special scrutiny were still receiving these penetrating and intrusive letters and questionnaires from the exempt organization's technical group based out of Washington, D.C. And many of these letters came with Lois Lerner's signature on it, indicating that the targeting went beyond merely just a database selection and was continued all the way through the 2012 election year. So 2010, 2011, 2012, this was going on for close to 3 years. And, it's very fishy, and the explanations we've been given is not satisfactory.
Well, yeah, and I'd like to talk about that because testimony initially came forth from the former IRS Commissioner Stephen Miller that, there were a couple of rogue employees at the IRS Cincinnati office responsible for this, but since that statement was made, we've learned that there are actually Washington, D.C. links. What do we know about this?
Well, the most recent testimony, this comes in the interview process. Not all the testimony being given is in the public hearings that you see on television. So we've gotten some transcripts from Oversight Chairman Darrell Issa on the House side, and one of the employees says that Washington, D.C. wanted some cases, quote, on the Tea Party, and another employee called the explanation that it was 2 rogue agents out of Cincinnati, quote, impossible. He explained, as an agent, we are controlled by many, many people. We have to submit many, many reports, so the chance of 2 agents being rogue and doing things like that could never happen. And Americans for Limited Government review of agency rules and revenue procedures that were used by the agents at the determinations unit and by the EO technical group out of Washington verifies that one of the specific criteria, EO determinations will refer to those applications that have been specifically reserved by revenue procedure or by other service instructions for handling by EO technical for purposes of establishing uniformity or centralized control of designated categories of cases. Now, there are no revenue procedures which we're saying to select out political groups, Tea Party groups, or anything based on the basis of political activity, which only leaves other official service instructions for handling by EO technical. And now the determinations people are saying, yes, in fact, we got special instructions from EO technical, and that is, in fact, based out of Washington, D.C. So the testimony already contradicts the original explanation. This was directed from the EO technical group, at least in Washington, D.C. But what we suspect happened is this all took place a little more than a month after the Citizens United decision came down, which ruled that nonprofit and for-profit corporations, and including a 501c4 group called Citizens United, were allowed to engage in independent expenditures, that is, advocacy for or against the candidate for public office. And just a month after that ruling, IRS is stepping in to try to figure out how they can shut down political speech by those who are under the tax-exempt function, even though tax-exempt groups have always been allowed to engage in political activity, particularly 501c4 groups. By rule, they're allowed, and by law, they're allowed to engage in political activity. So there's no reason they should have been selected for special scrutiny.
Yeah, well, and that really begs the question is, why would the D.C. office have specific interest in Tea Party groups?
Well, someone put them up to it, and certainly they were. They say they were looking for groups engaged in political activity, and even if that's all they were doing, that would be an egregious violation of the First Amendment, and certainly viewpoint discrimination on the basis that their viewpoints were political. So I think there's a constitutional issue here, and many of these groups are suing now in federal court, and I believe we'll get a First Amendment basis for this. There could be criminal conduct here. There's certainly the agency rules to be considered. The FBI is investigating, and and folks are testifying about this, trying to either expose culpability or to avoid culpability. So you might have some obstruction of justice going on here, or at least just a simple perjury if people are lying under oath.
Yesterday, your organization, Americans for Limited Government, issued a press release indicating that this targeting by the IRS violated an employee contract. I think you kind of alluded to that, pertaining to political coercion. Could you explain that for us?
I sure could. The IRS is unionized, and the National Treasury Employees Union, they have a contract agreement with the Internal Revenue Service that basically states that they're not supposed to be engaged in political coercion. Now, in one respect, this is just a simple anti-patronage type of deal where you're not going to have to go campaign for a particular candidate if you want to keep your job, and many state and localities will have similar rules protecting it. But it also states in Section 8 of the preamble that employees should be protected against arbitrary action, personal favoritism, or coercion for partisan political purposes, and prohibited from using their official authority or influence for the purpose of interfering with or affecting the result of an election or nomination for election. So clearly these were actions that were designed to shut down, in the least, political speech in the 2010 election cycle and going forward. And that would certainly appear to violate the spirit, if not the letter, of the contract that the employees were signatory to. And And maybe that's one of the reasons why many of these employees feel like they're being thrown under the bus. They never thought it was a good idea, and they had strong misgivings about it. One employee apparently requested a transfer as a direct result of the Tea Party targeting.
Now, I mean, the statement you made, being thrown under the bus, this was an IRS employee who actually used that term. Mm-hmm. I mean, they felt that they were just being used here. They felt that they were lower than dirt and being thrown under the bus. Your thoughts on this?
Well, I think those employees do have a lot to be upset about, particularly if they were directed in what they believed was good faith to engage in a new policy. And then those who actually had directed the policy, who had ordered the policy, were suddenly trying to avoid culpability and say, oh, this is just rogue agents. They came up with this idea all by themselves.
Yeah.
But we know that's not factual. And to get to the bottom of this, Americans for Limited Government believes we really need a special counsel to investigate this. That is a special prosecutor. It used to be that Congress could appoint these, but that law has since lapsed in 1999. The decision now rests solely with the Attorney General, Eric Holder, who would be responsible for appointing the special counsel.
Yeah, and he's the subject of numerous issues pertaining to scandal as well, whether it be the AP Fox News thing or the Benghazi or Fast and Furious. Mm-hmm. Wow. Let me ask you this, Robert. The questions certainly do remain on this. Has anyone specifically been named or identified as ordering this intense scrutiny?
So far, we don't know. That hasn't come forward yet. I mean, the most damning thing we've seen thus far is from the employees stating that EO Technical out of Washington had ordered this, and the reading on the rules would indicate that is one of the bases under which specific categories of cases can be centralized under the IRS rules. So that is where all the evidence is pointing right now. So I believe the next step is to get the EO Technical people in there who were responsible for sending these questions out. And once the groups were selected for special scrutiny, into testify as well to see what they know on their end. Whereas a lot of the employees, it appears, who have testified thus far were out of the Cincinnati office.
Now, just to define our term, EO Technical, that's referring to exempt organization technical?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's the Washington. Yeah, they're the ones who handled the special scrutiny. They're the ones who sent the intrusive letters, and they were probably being directed. Many of these letters were modified during the period in which the scandal took place. So who made the modifications to the letters that were going out? Who decided what types of questions would be asked of political types of organizations to see what degree of political activity they were engaged in? Now, a technical note is that 501c4s are allowed to engage in political activity as long as it's not a majority of their activity. It appears here they were attempting to discern on the basis that they said they would engage in political activity, that somehow that was going to be the primary focus of the group, even if they were going to also be doing lobbying, issue advocacy, and other non-political, political being defined as electioneering activity. But that's like trying to determine it on an a priori basis, when really that was just a job for examinations, whereas if a group at the end of the tax year, it was determined they spent the majority of their money on electioneering and they were trying to say they were a C4, well, they were probably in the wrong tax status. But that's a job for examinations, not determinations.
Robert Romano is our guest today, senior editor with Americans for Limited Government. We'll take a quick 60-second break, and we're going to come back and talk more about this issue. You're listening to Crosstalk on the VCY America Network.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, Noah's Ark researcher at the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, is it possible that the pairs of animals on board Noah's Ark could have repopulated the world as we see it today?
Chris, it's very possible. Given the Bible's command to migrate and fill the earth and knowing what we know about reproduction and multiplication, it's very possible that starting with 2 of each kind of animal, all of the world's animals could be produced in just a few thousand years. Conditions for life right after the flood were different than before the flood, in which things were quite ideal. But animals still enjoyed high birth rates and low death rates. Eventually, things tapered off to the present situation. Chris, if you work out the math, then everything we know fits that back to Genesis model.
Thanks, Dr. Morris. For more on Genesis, visit us on the web at www.icr.org. That's www.icr.org. Until next time, I'm Chris O'Brien.
You're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America. Our guest today is Robert Romano from Americans for Limited Government. We're talking about the growing IRS scandal. One of those that came to testify before a committee, Robert, was none other than Lois Lerner. And she is one who said, I did nothing wrong, everything is fine, and then pleaded the fifth. Has she been called back to testify? What has become of Lois Lerner?
Well, the committee chair, Darrell Eisler, said that the council was looking into whether or not she had waived her Fifth Amendment right by first issuing an opening statement under oath, and then that the council had determined that she had waived her right and that they were going to call her back. They haven't done so just yet, to my knowledge, and so I guess we're waiting to hear from her again. I doubt they'll get much information from her unless they grant her, unless there's a deal on the table to grant her immunity if she knows something else. If she was the one who directed this, then we probably shouldn't expect to hear much from her at all.
Yesterday, WND, WorldNet Daily, reported that while hundreds of conservative nonprofit groups were having their tax-exempt status delayed or denied, it was quietly restoring the tax-exempt status of an Islamist front group that's been accused of collaborating with terrorists. It's the Washington-based Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, who reportedly had years of delinquent tax filings, and yet as their officials met with officials inside the White House, the decision was made to renew CARE's tax-exempt status. No problems. Other applications, left-leaning groups are alleged to have sailed through the IRS. Are you aware of disparities that have occurred between right-leaning and left-leaning groups?
Clearly, just on the basis of the IG report, that the only groups that were selected out using a kind of a word search, a name search, were Tea Party groups, Patriot groups, things like groups like that. Supposedly, there were about 200 other groups that were not selected on that basis of criteria, and they say they were just looking at the types of political activities that they were engaged in. But no left-leaning groups, like on a basis of searching for the word progressive, was that didn't happen in this case, and that's been indicated by the Inspector General in his own report and in testimony. So in terms of specifically targeting by name, all you have are conservative groups, and certainly they're not going after left-leaning groups or other pro-Islamic groups in this capacity.
More amazing testimony came forth yesterday. One witness was a John Eastman, chairman of the National Organization of Marriage, who indicated in his testimony that their 990 tax return, which had a listing of their donors that they had submitted to the IRS, was actually leaked by the IRS to the Human Rights Campaign, a gay rights advocacy group, who then published the information on their website, and what was used to do what he said, to embarrass and chill their donors. I mean, this is really baffling.
This is why the Supreme Court ruled about 50 years ago in a case with the NAACP that they did not have to disclose their donors. That in cases where it would have a chilling effect on speech. And I think we're learning now just why some of these disclosure laws, when you're forcing disclosure on somebody or you're going to leak out the information from the agency, is such an egregious abuse. And really, I mean, the whole debate over the Disclose Act that was going on in 2010, and they didn't get their way, the Democrats, and then this is the lengths that the administration proceeded to in order to out donors to groups that they disagreed with. I mean, the idea that this was not politically motivated. I mean, what other reason is there to do this other than to chill speech, other than to embarrass people or to make themselves targeted if they were donating to groups that the leftists disagreed with. I mean, this really stinks to high heaven, and I can't imagine that this was just a coincidence, that all these groups were being that having their tax returns disclosed publicly when that's illegal. Was just all a coincidence while the Tea Party targeting was going on, while the debate for the Disclose Act is going on, while all in the wake of the Citizens United ruling. I mean, that's one heck of a coincidence. And with one action, you could say, okay, yeah, maybe it was just a mess up. But when you have one action followed by another action, by all independent actors who would have had to be all acting coincidentally, the chances of it being a coincidence are infinitesimal, if not impossible. It strains believability that this is all somehow a mess up or a coincidence, that all these things were happening at once. Yeah. It appears more like a coordinated campaign.
And to see the scrutiny that was given among certain organizations, there were a number of allegations made by witnesses, even in their opening statements yesterday, that some of these questionnaires that they had to fill out from the IRS to self-report details of prayer meetings required them to disclose the political activities of family members or group founders, probe the political beliefs of the organization's founders, requested membership donor lists, asked to see copies of internal communications, demanded detailed statements of the group's advocacy goals and political objectives. And on one group yesterday, Robert, Coalition for Life of Iowa, said they were even told that they were to promise not to protest in front of Planned Parenthood.
That's all of which violates their First Amendment rights. And it's just unbelievable that this is the reality that we're dealing with, and that this could happen at the agency and nobody's running to the public is disappointing. But hopefully some of these employees who just thought they were, engaged, just following the rules, following what their superiors were telling them to do, and just doing their jobs. Hopefully they'll keep an accurate assessment of what did happen, who directed it, and so the American people and congressional investigators and criminal investigators can get to the bottom of who was certainly responsible for this.
Do you believe that this scandal goes directly to the White House? I mean, we saw how many visits were made by IRS personnel to the White House, more than leading cabinet level members?
It could. I mean, Obama certainly created a climate in which this would be something that might be encouraged. And when you consider him calling out the Supreme Court in the State of the Union address, right after the Citizens United ruling, to mischaracterize what they had ruled on, and followed up by the Disclose campaign, followed up by, take Max Baucus's letter to Doug Shulman in September of 2010. Now, this is, several months after the targeting that had begun, but he was asking the IRS to take a close look at the political activities of 501c4 organizations. He had several footnotes of groups that he was referencing who were going to be raising campaign dollars. Then they were all Republican groups. They were all conservative groups. He didn't have a single footnote about a liberal group or liberal groups that were raising money for the 2010 election cycle. And so the intent is very clear. I mean, did Baucus know about the targeting already and merely contrived the letter so that he could, take credit for having asked the IRS to do this very thing? Was it just a coincidence? Like I said, there was definitely a climate there for this type of thing to occur. The fact that it was occurring, or they were imposing Disclose Act style types of regulations without actually passing the law, certainly fits into the pattern of the Obama administration, where when they can't get their way via the legislative process, they go in via regulatory or executive action. We've talked about before the Environmental Protection Agency issuing the carbon endangerment finding that rules that carbon dioxide is a harmful pollutant. There's nothing in the Clean Air Act that says it's a harmful pollutant, but the EPA just issued a regulation based on a fallacious court ruling that they could issue said regulation that it was a harmful pollutant. So, and there are countless examples of how the Obama administration has done that. They engage it where Congress won't act, I will, he says. He said it repeatedly.
Yeah, and you brought up the EPA, and it's interesting because I came across a Fox News article reporting about what they say a second federal agency facing a probe and accusations of political bias over its alleged targeting of conservative groups. They're referring to the EPA, accused of trying to charge conservative groups fees while largely exempting liberal groups, those making the Freedom of Information Act request. Allegedly, the EPA would waive them for liberal groups far more often than it would for conservative groups. Another indication that there's disparity going on here.
Yep, and way too much discretion that is allowed to be engaged by these agencies. And, a lot of hosts and pundits and elected officials talk about the administrative state, and that's what it is. I mean, they're pretty much on their own. I mean, the idea of congressional oversight is long since gone when Congress has granted its authority to make law away to these regulatory agencies who issue these regulations without any basis in law, and they're responsible for enforcing them, and they're responsible for levying fines and issuing judgment without the same rules of evidence that you see in federal court. Americans for Limited Government would favor legislation that would rein that in and certainly take away the quasi-judicial powers that you see at these regulatory agencies, and make it so that every single regulation that is proposed has to be approved by Congress. And if it's not, then it doesn't become a rule. And take away their discretion to do all this stuff, because right now we don't have representation when all of the most important rules are not being voted upon by our elected officials.
And Robert, yesterday, I mean, there was things that are just making this whole scandal even murkier as information has been coming forth about the very lavish accommodations for IRS employees attending these conferences, including the deputy IRS commissioner spending 5 nights in the presidential suite across the street from Disneyland. Accommodations are ordinarily priced at $1,499 a night. Treasury Department's has a record of some 225 employee conferences costing taxpayers $50 million, many of these at casino resorts. And yet there's so many receipts that are missing. They don't know the sum total cost of this. I mean, it appears we've got an agency that's run amok.
Yep, and I bet you it would be like that at pretty much every federal agency that has such a budget. I mean, the idea that you're going to give all this money and such discretion to an agency, and they're not going to waste it, they're not going to blow it on things, they're not going to give out perks and engage in wasteful activities like these is not at all surprising. Based upon what we know about the budget and how it's allocated. Once they get a blanket sum of money every single year, and then the agency heads get to decide how they want to spend it, what they're going to prioritize. Such sweeping discretion that Congress has given away. I mean, they're hardly a legislative body at all when they have no say whatsoever in how the tax dollars are spent. And that is not the system that the Founding Fathers created. It's completely unconstitutional. None of this should be happening.
Newsmax is reporting that former White House senior advisor David Plouffe on Sunday said that Republicans in Congress are wasting too much time on Obama administration scandals instead of focusing their efforts on economic issues that matter to the American people. I'd like to get your response on that. Do we need to just brush this under the rug and move on, or is getting to the bottom of this scandal really the business of the people?
I think it is the business of the people, and the idea that Congress doesn't spend enough time on budgetary matters, for example. We've been arguing over debt ceilings and continuing resolutions at regular intervals over the past 2 years since Republicans took the House majority. And certainly they've spent a lot of time on that. I'm certain they'll continue to spend a lot of time on that. But that somehow, maybe Mr. Plouffe thinks this is a big distraction for the Obama administration, and well, that's too bad. As Tom Brokaw said, welcome to the second term, Mr. President.
Yeah. Well, we're going to take a quick 60-second break, and folks, after the break, we're going to find out from our guest, what can you do? What can American citizens do regarding this issue? In the meantime, if you'd like to get on board with us, our number to crosstalk is 800-733-9829. What is your reaction? 800-733-9829. This is Crosstalk.
Was the creation week literally 6 days? Does science point to an old Earth? Young Earth creationists and old Earth creationists have been debating their respective positions for 2 centuries. The controversy has become one of the major battles in the modern church. An increasing number of 20-somethings who once attended church faithfully have stated that the idea that the Earth is millions of years old was one thing that caused them to start doubting the Bible and leave the church. In the book Old Earth Creationism on Trial, co-authors Tim Chaffee and Jason Lyle examine the claims made by Old Earth creationists and provide biblical evidence that refutes those claims and brings us back to the authority of Scripture. They tackle issues like the gap theory, a local versus universal flood, and many other related issues. To obtain a copy of Old Earth Creationism on Trial, send a donation of $16 or more to VCY America, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208. To donate by phone, call 1-800-729-9829.
You're listening to Crosstalk here on VCY America. Robert Romano is with us from Americans for Limited Government. We're talking about the growing IRS scandal today. And we'd like to get your reaction to things that are going on. What questions go in your mind that are unanswered regarding this scandal? What issues do you wish to find out? What issues do you believe the American people need to know about? Our telephone number to Crosstalk, 800-733-9829. 1-800-733-9829. Robert, the question somebody ask and think about is, here I am, I'm sitting all alone in this small community and in this state, and what can I do? How can I make a difference on this matter? What power, what authority do I have as a normal American citizen?
Well, the one thing they can do is contact the Attorney General's office via correspondence, and they should have an outreach phone number you can call to encourage Attorney General Eric Holder to appoint a special counsel in this scandal, to recuse himself and to give the authority of the Attorney General to a special prosecutor. George W. Bush appointed a special counsel, if you recall, in the Scooter Libby case. Mm-hmm. And I think that's appropriate in this case. The statute states that under extraordinary circumstances, the Attorney General should appoint a special counsel. And the Inspector General was just testifying today that what happened was unprecedented. I'm sorry, and I believe that testimony was yesterday, but he called this unprecedented. This has never happened before. So, and went as far to suggest this was even worse than what Nixon had done with IRS agency abuses and looking at people's tax returns. This goes above and beyond that. And so certainly the case for a special criminal probe here and to find out who is responsible and to have the full subpoena power of the Attorney General and the ability to go and seek out the warrants and to follow the leads wherever they may be. So the American people need to demand that Eric Holder appoint a special counsel here. Otherwise, we may never find out who directed this.
Do we also, is it wise for people to be contacting their senators and their congressmen regarding this to continue on probing and getting to the bottom of this?
Well, I'm confident that they are, that they're really digging in here, and they're going to do to the best of their ability expose a bright light on this, and that certainly cannot hurt. And particularly if you were in one of these groups that was targeted to bring that to the attention of congressional investigators. If you were one of these groups that were applying for tax-exempt status and was either denied or delayed, that could actually help the investigators to get to the bottom of this.
Folks, the Department of Justice does have a comment line that they post. It's the Office of the Attorney General comment line. That number is 202-353-1555. That's 202-353-1555. To the public comment line for the Department of Justice. And the other number they provide for the public is their main switchboard, which is 202-514-2000. That's 514-2000. Again, area code 202. And if you were speaking with the Attorney General's office today, what would you be saying to them, Robert?
Just what I just said, that this is extraordinary. The statute gives him authority to appoint a special counsel, and this was probably the most egregious case of viewpoint discrimination, political viewpoint discrimination in the history of the agency. And in order to ensure the American people that politics will not dictate the outcome of this investigation that the FBI is engaged in, he needs to recuse himself and appoint a special counsel. It's the only way you can assure that an independent mind is looking at this and not a political appointee.
Our phone number to Crosstalk, 800-733-9829. Your reaction to this, folks, does this outrage you? Are you concerned? Does this have implications for churches down the road here as well? Other nonprofit groups, pro-life agencies? Number 800-733-9829. Let's go to Michael in Pensacola, Florida. Michael, you're on the air.
Yes, sir. My thing is over here. The IRS has been having conferences and been spinning out of control for 30 or 40 years now. And my thing is, I want to know why Cummings is a big concern now. It concerned me back when Reagan was in office and people were doing outrageous stuff. So what's the big beef now?
Okay, thank you. What about it, Robert? We've always had problems with some of the things going on at the IRS. Why now?
Well, certainly with the out-of-control agency budgets, which we, covered in the last half hour, they have way too much discretion. And is Congress going to do something about this administrative state in terms of how their budgeting decisions are being made, and what are they going to go line by line and tell the agencies what they're allowed to spend money on and not? And sadly, I'm doubtful that that is the direction Congress is going in, when we're simply operating by continuing resolution. And on one hand, continuing resolutions are actually holding back spending. When you have the actual appropriations process going forward, it actually tends to increase spending. It's the times when you have debt ceiling impasses, government shutdowns, the threat of a government shutdown, or simply governing by continuing resolution that you actually see discretionary spending cut. And that's as particular grants of budget authority tend to expire. But having said that, is Congress going to dig in and really unravel how the agency budgets are put together and how much discretion they have? I really doubt it.
I guess the other thing we're seeing here too, Michael, is just the proliferation of what's come forth about using the IRS for political purposes. And that new revelation, it happened during the Nixon administration. We saw what happened there. But we are seeing that testimony coming forth that it's now being used for political purposes, and certainly that ought to cause into question what's going on here too.
Well, see, my point is, it really doesn't matter because Congress and the senators and the IRS, they're all in the same bed together. They're not going to change.
Well, thank you for your comments.
He's probably right, and I think that why are we paying attention to this now? People are paying attention, and so you find more information about what the agency's up to, and say, hey, if you think what they did in the Tea Party and other groups, religious groups as well, targeting, take a look at how they're spending their agency budget. So I think the purpose of that story and calling attention to it is to really keep people focused on just what this agency is up to and just how out of control, not just this agency, but the entire federal bureaucracy really is. It helps to generate political consensus that something needs to be done about it, because unless the American people are demanding that something change and vote that way, the politicians are never going to pay attention.
Folks, you can get through to us here today at Crosstalk. Have some open lines, 800-733-9829, 800-733-9829. Do we continue with life as usual, or do we need to ask some probing questions and get down to the bottom of this issue? Our number, 800-733-9829. Robert, I want to ask you this. With all these scandals going on, we understand that there are 5 cabinet-level inspector general positions that remain open as of this point. That should be concerning to us as well, shouldn't it?
Yes, and the fact that the Obama administration, Barack Obama, hasn't even bothered to appoint anyone to those positions. So right now you have acting inspector generals that are in those positions. And what agency insiders will tell you is that an acting inspector general is not going to pursue investigations nearly as diligently as somebody who has been Senate confirmed, because they're actually trying to get the Senate confirmed position, so they don't want to rock the boat and jeopardize getting nominated. Or so the thinking goes. But no, the Obama administration has not bothered to even nominate somebody for those five, and that includes the Department of Labor, the Department of Defense, I believe the Department of State. I could get that for you in a second. But no, I mean, those positions remain unfilled, and I don't believe they intend to fill them for the duration. This goes all the way back to 2009.
Wow. Well, let's pick up our next call from Milwaukee. Susan, you're on the air.
Hi. Does he believe that having Eric Holder, who they're considering indicting for perjury as to his response to a question, is better? It's better for him to select somebody. I don't trust who he would select. I would think I'd rather have it in charge of the other people. And then one more thing about that is that I heard if it was a select prosecutor, it would be, Mark Levine said it would be a year later, maybe half a year later, that we would get some kind of results. Thank you.
Okay.
As long as it takes. The idea behind an independent investigation is to remove the politics from it. Right now, under the current FBI investigation, they do, in fact, answer to Attorney General Holder. So the question really to ask yourself is, do you want Eric Holder handling the investigation into the IRS matter, particularly considering the troubles he's having with the AP, with his own testimony in front of Congress, whether or not he perjured himself being a question? I don't think the American people trust him to handle this investigation. In fact, a Quinnipiac University poll just recently came out, found out that 76% of Americans favor a special prosecutor in the IRS case, including 63% of Democrats. If we have to wait 365 days to see results in the criminal probe, if it happened on an independent basis, well, really that's a short time to wait, and that and certainly Congress is not going to stop investigating. As a result of that, I've heard other claims against a special prosecutor that people are going to clam up, they're going to plead the fifth. Well, Lois Lerner, she already pleaded the fifth, and the Obama administration is purportedly engaged in a criminal investigation, but we can't be assured that it's removed from the political decision-making process.
I found here the agencies lacking the Inspector General, Department of State, Interior, Labor, Defense, Homeland Security lacking an Inspector General, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the agency as well for international development. Folks, there's much that needs to happen there, too. Alan in Danville, Kentucky, you're on the air.
Yes, Terry Stevens, thanks for taking my call. My concern is that we have become desensitized to the truth simply because what the gentleman said is happening ever since Reagan. Robert correctly pointed out that we had problems back with Nixon prior to Reagan, but I point out that we've had problems with the State Department back into the 1920s. When you elect the most radically left-wing Marxist communist senator to become your president, he's going to bring a whole lot of folk with him. And I think this is just the fallout. They weren't being watched very closely to begin with, speaking of the IRS, but now they're actually being directed to do things that are totally illegal. And I think the difference between now and what has gone on is the average Joe, even if he's not a born-again believer, even if he's not an American patriot, is beginning to stand up and see what's going on around him, that the chaos that our country is falling into. And I'm going to say that I'm not the first one to say that the condition of America is a direct result of the condition of the church. I'd like to hear y'all respond to that.
Thank you, Alan. Any thoughts, Robert?
Well, I mean, going back to this is really like 100 years in the making. If you go back to the Wilson administration in the 19-teens, when a lot of this administrative bureaucracy starts to get off the ground, including the IRS, the Federal Reserve going forward, and the state of our society is certainly, going to be dictated in large degree by how out of control the government is. I mean, that's the sad story of history, is out of control governments depriving people of their rights. And do we have the moral compass to guide our way through that and select the right leaders?
We'll be back in 60 seconds. You're listening to Crosstalk.
For the Worldview Weekend Minute, I'm Brandon House. Our website is worldviewweekend.com. We're continuing our series on a biblical worldview and money. We're on point number 15 of 20 today. Number 15 is a wise man is aware of his financial resources and plans accordingly. We see this in several places. Just a few verses would be Proverbs 27, verses 23 to 24, Proverbs 27, verse 12, Proverbs 24, verses 3 through 4. A wise man is aware of his financial resources and plans accordingly. If you don't have the money to do something, don't go do it. You save. Or if you see that there's a bill coming due, you conserve, you plan. So this is clearly something we're told to do in the Scripture. It's not wrong to have things. It's not wrong to have resources. We just need to use them properly. Number 16, a wise man works, saves, plans, and will have food. But the man that wastes time in foolish pursuits will fall into poverty. Proverbs 28:19 speaks to that. Let's have a biblical worldview for money.
Robert Romano is with us today from Citizens or Americans for Limited Government. Their website, getliberty.org, getliberty.org. Back to the phone lines to Wyoming, Minnesota. And Al, thanks for calling. You're on the air.
Yeah, thanks for taking my call. See, what I wanted to state was that all these investigations will be great, especially if we get to the end of it. But if conservatives do not take a golden opportunity here, which this is, to get rid of the IRS, take away their power, and bring in a flat tax where we can actually control them, not the other way around, it's all going to be right back to where it was before in a few years anyways.
Yeah, and Robert, I'll have you comment on this, but we have the complication as well with the IRS taking control over the implementation of Obamacare.
Absolutely. And certainly this is an opportunity for Republicans to take that agency apart, not only piece by piece, but take a wholesale look at the entire tax code and the complexity that's there. Why are there rules on the political activities of tax-exempt organizations when groups that, like 527, there's a classification for political action committees, are allowed to engage in unlimited electioneering on their rules? They have to disclose their donors, but they're all similarly tax-exempt. So whether you are disclosing your donors or not, the purposes for political activity are tax exempt. There's no, in other words, there's no taxable event there. There's no profit being derived. There's no tax on political donations to candidates or to political action committees or to 501c4s or to charities. And so these are all tax exempt functions. So I think that taking that apart and taking the agency apart and taking away their discretion and having legislation specifically tailored to that level. Now, the trouble with going into marginal tax rates and the like is the American people may have a little trouble connecting what does marginal tax rates have to do with the scandal that took place. So I think that the legislation, it can have the effect of flattening the tax code, but it's certainly the primary purpose, if you're addressing the scandal, is to keep it in that direction when you're talking about it, and that this will rein in the agency and prevent these types of abuses from occurring again.
Thank you, Al, and certainly we've created a bureaucracy that has brought us to this point. Twin Falls, Idaho. Carol, you're on the air. Hello, Carol. Carol.
Hello.
Okay, James in Ainsworth. Sorry, we missed Carol there. James in Ainsworth, you're on the air. I'm sorry, James, you're breaking up on your phone there. Okay, we lost James. Let's try Andrew in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. You're on the air.
Hey, how are you? I was going to ask a question. You know, you're talking about bringing all these, the senator from Illinois, bringing all these people with him. Like so often does when new people take office, they bring people with them. And people they work with them know. But when you got a president, like any president, who has layers and layers of insulation in all these departments and stuff, given that nothing happens by accident, who most probably is orchestrating things behind the scene?
Well, isn't that what we're trying to find out right now, Robert?
It sure is. I mean, the big question of who directed this, specific to the IRS, is it's an open question at this stage. I mean, certainly roads appear to lead to Washington based upon the testimony of IRS employees based out of Cincinnati, saying they were directed from Washington to do this. So where does that go? Where does that lead? They have to now they have to call in the folks who work in Washington to say, well, who told you to do it? And where did this criteria come from? What I suspect is out there is either a directive, a memo, or something that was verbally instruction related to the response to Citizens United and what looks to be a coordinated campaign to defy the Supreme Court ruling.
Let me ask this question if I've got a minute. Is it possible that within an administration you have mavericks running loose, calling their own shots?
You mean somebody, not the president, who's directing these types of activities?
Right. In other words, the president can't. The only information he gets is from his advisors or the cabinet, and they have a prerogative just by information to let him know what they think he needs to know without necessarily letting him know everything. And therefore, you create an environment where you have some maverick off in the sunset with their agenda and their department and their staffs. And all of a sudden, you got a bunch of chieftains behind the scenes creating a deal like you got.
Well, if the president really didn't know anything about this and he was so disinterested in what the federal bureaucracy is going to do, number one, why did he ever want to become president to begin with? But number two, he certainly would have created a climate where that sort of thing could occur.
Let's go to James in Ainsworth, Nebraska. James, we got you back here. Hello, James.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Well, I just got nonprofit status about a month ago. It's called Sandals Rainmaker, and it's a project at Walker. But it's a way to pay off the national deficit, and it took 4 years to get this nonprofit status. Okay? I audited 3 years in a row.
Okay, I'm sorry, James. You're breaking up here quite a bit. We're not able to obtain your question here. Robert, we have about a minute left. Let me just ask you this. Why does all this matter?
Well, this matters because we're going to try to determine what kind of country we want to live in. And do we want an out-of-control bureaucracy that can do whatever it wants without any congressional oversight, without any guidance in the law, and can just implement rules and directives and levy fines on the American people who have no rights to challenge these things in court and war to means to? And that's really the issue here, is that we have a government that is so large and so out of control, it is not representative, nor can we vote the people out who are responsible for this police state. I think that's really the issue, is what do we want a limited government with enumerated powers, or do we want this out of control the administrative state?
Robert Romano with us from Americans for Limited Government. Their website, getliberty.org, getliberty.org. And also, folks, the Department of Justice does have a public comment line, that number 202-353-1555, I believe that is. Yes, 202-353-1555. Robert, we appreciate you being with us today.
Hey, no problem. Only Eric Holder can appoint that special counsel.
And, folks, he's the one certainly to contact here to appoint that counsel, 202-353-1555. Thanks for joining us today on Crosstalk.
Listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Tape Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208, or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.